Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for Compassionate Interventions to White Supremacy. My name is Rochelle Faithful, and I am a folk healing artist and healing justice practitioner based in Washington, D.C. And I am rooted in the tradition of conjure, which is an African diasporic tradition of enslaved people of the Southern United States. And before I was initiated into the healing arts, the shamanic healing arts, I was a community organizer and a people's lawyer. So I am a person who is and has been at the intersections of thinking about social justice and healing for a long time. And I'm really excited for you all to join me in this exploration into what it means to be thinking about engaging in racial justice and doing so in a way that allows all of us to be humanized. Tonight, I'll be sharing a little bit about some of my own thinking as well as my community's thinking around what compassionate interventions to white supremacy could even mean. And we'll probably spend maybe 30 to 45 minutes in a presentation, but also conversation with you all. And then I really want to spend the remainder of our time complicating all these things that we set up by walking through some examples. And that's examples from my own life, as well as yours, as a way to actually think about how these things mean to us when applied. Also, by way of introduction, this conversation is part of an ongoing series that I started about a year ago called Human Ecology of Racism, which I call HER for short. So some folks who are joining us today or watch the video have been a part of that community. It's one that I intend to also bring back, perhaps later in the spring. And there, that is a space of thinking about white solidarity. It's kind of like 4.0, really thinking about what it means to get beyond just the concepts that many folks have learned around anti-racism and really thinking about and actually being with what it means to embody these values and thinking about that from the lens of healing, particularly for folks who are conditioned to wield power and conditioned to have status, right? So thank you for being part of this conversation, which is a part of this broader ongoing conversation. Last detail, many folks are joining us now, which is great. And this will be recorded and is being recorded and posted online on my YouTube channel, which I'm trying to use more of. So just be aware as we have our conversation tonight that we are being recorded. So just to keep that in mind as we have our conversation. So with that, thanks for y'all for being here. I'm still trying to get used to virtual spaces where everyone can get introduced and we share about our lives. But for these purposes, I'm just grateful that you're here with me, and I think we'll get to know each other a little bit as we go through the second half of our time together. So let's start with some of the concepts that I want to bring forward, especially to make sure we're just on the same page as well and have some shared understanding around some critical aspects. So I will be sharing my screen here. Great. So compassionate intervention to white supremacy for our times. So, moved 2 ahead. There we go. So I want to start to make sure that folks understand what I'm meaning when I talk about compassion and when I talk about white supremacy in particular. We can get into what interventions mean, but I felt these were most important. So when I talk about compassion or compassionate responses, for me, I have a less of a textbook definition. I have a definition that's more based on what I view as an extension of depth and complexity as a form of healing, as a form of relating. So compassionate as an extension of depth and complexity as a form of relating. So to me, compassion is not synonymous. It's not the same as empathy, though there's a quality of that to be empathetic when we think about compassion. To me, compassion is about the practice of appreciating that our human condition is really, really hard. It is very, very complex. And in that, the more that we can extend or understand the depth of any given context or the complexity of any given context, that's a form of extending compassion. And especially when we're talking about relating to one another, and in an ecological sense, not just to each other's people, but the beings that we share the earth with and the elements of the earth herself, we're really thinking about just the ways that our heart can know and the ways that we can really see the layers of reality that exist and hold that with some sort of relationship, some sort of connection. So that's what I mean by compassionate. Totally welcome for you to bring in your own meaning to it, but that's where I'm studying from. And then white supremacy. And I'm aware that this term has evolved over time. It has, even in the last, 15, 18 years, I've been in social justice movement. White supremacy has evolved to represent this kind of individual worldview that promotes hate and white superiority, to a more complex and robust definition, which is what I would like to start with here. So we're not talking only about this self-conscious racism of like white supremacist hate groups that believe that white people are superior to all those of other races, especially Black folks, and therefore should dominate society. But we're really also thinking about the social, political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement that are widespread, I would say also endemic, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination that are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. And this is a useful definition from Frances Lee Ansley from 1991. So this is really important because I think, as I said, this term I think has evolved over time. When I talk about white supremacy, I'm really talking about systems that affect us at every level, even internally. But there's systems of domination that allow folks who either identify as white or who are white passing to control disproportionate amounts of power, of resources, whose ideas are considered superior, entitlement that's widespread, and the fact that this is enacted daily and can be very subtle as well. So that's what I mean by white supremacy. So when we put this together, what we really mean is we're trying to find ways in which we can not only dismantle the system, but reimagine other systems that can take its place, with a sense of still holding the humanness that is still true for all of us through compassion. So I work with a few different assumptions, and these may not be your assumptions, so I want to make this clear. And I am very excited to have conversations about these assumptions, but I think it's important to locate where I'm at. I believe that each person and being is inherently valuable and indisposable. And that belief an assumption can be in tension with some of our other needs, which we'll talk about probably throughout the rest of our time here. But I do start with that deeply held belief that every person and being is inherently valuable and indisposable. I do believe that we are all conditioned, or I use the word poison because I think about toxins and antidotes. So we are all poisoned by systems of domination, including and especially white supremacy. So I'm a person who believes both in intersectionality, the belief that there are different systems that impact us all depending sometimes on identity, but sometimes on experience, and sometimes based on other factors. I also believe that these systems work in concert, so together with other aspects of our individuality, right? So our particular personalities or our particular histories or our particular worldviews. So to me, they're not in exclusion to one another, like our particular individuality and our experiences, but they work together with these systems and are shaped by these systems. I also assume that parts of ourselves are instruments of harm via the systems of domination. So what I mean by that is I try to not essentialize people entirely, even folks who are white identified or white passing, because we can generalize your experience, but we also know that your experience is as complicated as everyone else. So I'm beginning to talk more about parts of ourselves that are conditioned, because most often that's a little more true, that there are parts of ourselves that are conditioned, parts of ourselves that are less conditioned, and parts of us that are just in process. So I think about parts of ourselves as instruments of harm, and here we're talking about levels of systemic harm. But that can also be internalized harm, that can be interpersonal harm, that can be communal harm. I believe it's important that we name harm when it happens, and that we require of ourselves and others less harmful action for our principled growth. So I don't assume that we are all striving toward a world of non-harm. I think that would be wonderful, but I kind of take a more Buddhist perspective of at least we can strive for less harm. And in that, the way that we can be in that striving is if we have real deeply rooted principles that allow us to grow and allow our spirits to be nourished and allow us to just be people that are more aligned with our sense of wholeness and our sense of value. I believe that accountability is about requiring principled growth. So when we ask of ourselves and others to be in that process of growth, of learning, of healing, and specifically accountability is something like how we enable and nurture that. There are a lot of questions, I think, open questions in our communities about how, but I think that is really what we're trying to get at when we think about accountability. And then finally, I believe that value-based relating, so relating to each other based on these principles and values that we hold, is more powerful, and I would say probably also more necessary than these kind of fear and reactive cycles that we find ourselves in. So my value around compassion comes from the fact that I believe not only does that honor our inherent value and indisposability, but I also just think it's more powerful. I think it gets us closer toward whatever belovedness, sacredness that we all possess and that we can experience together. So I'm actually going to stop the share for a moment and invite any questions. And for that, I'll ask folks to either submit questions via the chat, which I can read out loud and respond to. Or if there are folks that want to, there should be an option for folks to raise their hand at the bottom of your panel. And also, we don't have a huge group tonight, so if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's great too. I'll just give a moment for folks to feel out everything I just shared on the definitions and assumptions and see if we are in a similar place. Chat. Okay. I'm going to keep speaking for a little while. So I'm going to allow all that to integrate and we will continue. Great. Thank you for the affirmation there. There's also one more thing I want to clarify before we move on about compassion, because I feel like this is a very live question in the communities that I'm a part of, which is I don't think compassion displaces other really valid emotions like anger, or reactions to pain or trauma, or fear. To me, I think we can have very compassionate responses that are actually informed by those other strong emotions. So we can talk about that complexity later, but I wanted to at least make that acknowledgement. Great. So folks are talking now, which is great. Some folks feel like we're in a similar place. Some folks are connecting to our definition of accountability, which is great. And Kate Lee is sharing via chat that I was recently speaking with someone who felt that accountability can often be used toxically among white people in terms of addressing white supremacy. Can you share thoughts on that? And looking forward to hearing more about how to keep one another accountable. Yes, that's largely what we're doing tonight. So the question is my thoughts on how accountability can be used toxically, especially among white people and probably in white solidarity movements. Yes, I have seen very similar things. And it's one of the reasons why I felt like we needed this space. I think we'll get into actually the next slide, so I'm gonna hold that thought. But I'll try to provide a specific example once we get to the next space. Okay, great, thank you. Let me share this screen again. Great. These are just the assumptions. So challenges to compassionate intervention, and this is where I think a lot of us are struggling with seeing a lot of, quote, toxicity in our communities when we're using this very now vague term of accountability. And I think the toxicity comes from some of these different things, especially in white solidarity movements. So this is not particular to white people, but the first challenge that I see is that there are parts of us that are essentialized as targets of domination. So I was mostly speaking from the part of me that is identified as a Black person, that's identified as a queer and trans person. Those are probably my main identities of targets of domination. There are also parts of me that are middle class. There are parts of me who are able-bodied, who are a US citizen, who speaks English, among other things, and other parts of my experience that are not targets of domination. But one thing I have seen in white solidarity spaces is that some folks feel if we are centering an identity that has more power, like whiteness, that we're marginalizing other aspects of them that are targets of domination. And when we're talking not about systemic harm, there are some people that feel that by centering white identity and the power associated with it, that we are ignoring their particular experiences of harm or being targets of domination. And that's a binary that I reject, a dichotomy that I reject. Because here, I think we can hold the both and of that. But I think some folks react really strongly to the centering whiteness. And I think that has to do in part with some of these other challenges here. So a second challenge is that some folks I've seen are overwhelmed by the harm that we experience or witness or learn. So if folks are actually deeply in touch, both in a conceptual understanding, but even more so an embodied understanding of the harm of white supremacy in particular, some folks are really, really overwhelmed by it and have different stress reactions to that overwhelm, right? And that so often I think can be projected onto other people, which is sometimes some of the really harsh accountability, so-called accountability that we see, is that folks feel a strong sense of urgency, which I appreciate. And some folks feel a real sense of perfectionism because they don't want to cause more harm. But in doing so and not being aware of their own experience and ways in which they might be projecting their experience onto others, and not actually being in relationship with people, much less a deep relationship with other people who are trying to also figure this out, that leads to a strong sense of projection over reaction. So that's another challenge that I think we see with compassionate intervention. Similarly, an overcorrection for what folks might perceive as willful ignorance of other people, other white people in particular, indifference to extreme harm. So it's very similar to what I talked about before about ways in which people might be dealing with overwhelm or other feelings that they feel like they can't hold or may not be in touch with. But if you feel like something is really deeply important and urgent, and you feel like others are dismissive of you or dismissive of your view, there might be a sense of overreaction, overcorrection. I think another really important challenge to compassionate intervention, especially in white solidarity community, is not adequately grappling with the guilt or shame of self-identification. So what I mean by that, I'm looking at some of the chats. Okay, so what I mean by that is if you're a person that, again, is having, is on a search or exploration of an embodied sense of what it means to be benefiting from a deeply harmful system that relies on the harm of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I have seen a lot of folks not know how to process, not know how to hold, and not know how to transform the legacy of that benefits that comes with that self-identification. And sometimes that means people get really stuck in wanting to help in racial justice, and they're not able to really get a more deeply embodied, complex, real compassionate relationship with other people to really help. So people just get stuck at a certain point. It means that that sense of guilt or shame can be so internalized that folks feel paralyzed around what they can do. Sometimes it means that we have another projection response. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about what projection means. So projection is just a very useful psychological term to describe the ways in which we have an experience. And rather than necessarily own that that's our experience, we map that or project that onto someone else and insist and act as if that is their experience and their experience alone. So in a way, it's denying what's actually our experience and putting it on someone else. And sometimes, like, a particular form of projection is scapegoating, right? When we blame others for things that we've contributed for. But it can also be broader. So here, as I also said with overwhelm, is that sometimes when we are overwhelmed by something in our lives, sometimes our stress response is to deny it's actually happening for us and to put that on others as if it is theirs alone. And that I think that happens pretty common. It's pretty common in white solidarity work, where folks may not fully own what's theirs and really have an expectation that others are not doing something well enough, not taking something as seriously as they should, or doing things wrong. And what I will also say about that that's so harmful is I think that's a way in which some of the most harmful parts of what we call white dominant culture is perpetuated. So there's a lot of different resources and kind of outlines out there about what white dominant culture is, but some of those elements include perfectionism, include linear thinking, include intellectualization. So sometimes folks who are not coming from the most embodied place are actually participating in those harmful elements and not aware of it or not owning it. And then that leads to actually insisting that other people are either doing something wrong or thinking about something wrong or some other deep judgment and criticism that loses the complexity and depth that we need for a compassionate response because they're actually engaging in white dominant culture themselves. So last but not least, some people, when they struggle with compassionate intervention, with that sense of urgency or that sense of bigness, really believe that the harm that is experienced has to be met with the same force. So what I mean by that is there are some people, I think, in white solidarity movements who are like, we don't need to do healing work because the issue is actually really big. And what we need to do is organize and deal with these big systems and tear these systems down. And we need to do it with as much force as the problem is. So we really have to attack it. And to me, that is a response that ultimately isn't very helpful if we really lose the nuance and the subtleties that exist and the complexities that exist. Because often we're ignoring other levels that are important because they exist for us, including the internal level, the personal level, the interpersonal level, and the family and community levels, which have a lot of meaning for us. This should be no exception when we think about systems of oppression and domination. And also sometimes we can be simply replicating the trauma that we know. So there are a lot of us who are healers in movement spaces that try really hard to not use war language, because we have deep questions about what it means to be in perpetual warfare. At whose expense does that warfare continue? Who does it actually serve? So these are just some challenges to compassionate intervention. And I want to pause again, because we talked about a lot of complex parts. And see where we are. And I want to make sure that folks feel clear about projection in particular, because there's a question about that. So welcoming questions, clarifications by chat, or if folks are feeling brave enough to speak, to unmute themselves or raise their hand. Okay, great. We seem clear in projection for now. Hey, Caitlin, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Rochelle. Thank you so much. I really appreciated this opening so far. And when you're talking about earlier folks being uncomfortable with grappling with their identity in this, I was thinking of a network of grant makers that I was speaking with this week, and they said they're building out this new like collaborative of funders, and they're going to call it like a social equity group. And the white leader said they were really uncomfortable with the term racial equity because it excluded, you know, gender or sexual orientation. And I wondered if it had to do with their discomfort with their own identity, whiteness. And so some of what you said reminded me of that discomfort and like not wanting to, you know, name race. And I'm also hoping through our conversation for folks who really do intellectualize, white folks who intellectualize these concepts and these conversations, that's very often where they start. And that's what's like accessible to them. And I'm hoping to hear from you how we can move folks along and maybe give them help them be more embodied, even if it's just taking deep breaths in meetings or gatherings, that kind of thing.
Totally. And that's actually very similar, thank you, Caitlin, to another question that Linda's posed about talking about how we can relate from a more embodied place. So I'm happy to spend a couple minutes on that. And actually, once I'm done sharing a little bit of what I recommend, I would love to hear from some other folks, if folks have their own practices. And ways that they try to do their own work and work with others around embodiment. So let's start with the workplace, because Caitlin, I think that's the setting of your question. I definitely think breathing is a really helpful tool. So having folks take collective breaths before meetings, more importantly during meetings, and actually having opportunities to pause and allow folks to actually regain a sense of centeredness is really important. I think increasingly in meeting space, I do incorporate check-ins at the beginning of calls, and I know some people do that as a practice, but it's almost rote. But I think it's really important to create some space for folks to, even with the prompt of like naming what they're coming in with, right? So we're not thinking like we're trying to make this artificial distinction that we're leaving other parts of our lives behind when we enter a space, because that fiction's not true, and people show up with what they show up with. I also think it's important to, especially because there's so much intellectual conversation and so many, at least certain more elite, quote, professional workplaces, that folks so often aren't asked what they feel. And that prompt is actually really important. So how you feel can be bypassed really easily. And I've been increasingly making sure I ask what people are feeling. So they have to describe something either in their body or a feeling or something else that's actually much more emotional and embodied than how they might feel, which might be an opinion or thought. So those are just a few like tricks, general tricks for the workplace that I use. In general, I am such a big fan, as you know, of just having some form of embodiment practice. And that doesn't have to be something that is a super demanding or intense practice. I think folks who can do mindfulness around breathing is really important, and making sure that you are breathing low and slow. And just even having that as a reminder throughout your day. Am I breathing low and slow? Most likely we're not. We're breathing from our chest. And you can take a moment of reflection of like, why? Like, have I just been going all day? Do I feel too much responsibility? What are the other reasons in my own history that I might just be disconnected from my body? Am I actually like worried about something or afraid of something? Am I at the edge of some sort of activation response? So having just a deep mindfulness practice around breathing can be really simple. And I really just love for folks to do more embodied things, right? So I'm trying to help people reframe embodiment practices as like extras, whether that's doing simple stretches every day, whether that is actually thinking about very thinking about the sacredness of cooking your own food and the tangibleness that comes, the sensuality that's connected to like actually creating a meal. When we think about even listening to music that really moves you and allowing you just to be with like the sound of the music. But so often I think about these days the connection between embodiment and emotion, and allowing folks to allow our bodies and emotion just to have space. So for some of us, that even means just creating some space where we don't have plans or an agenda, or, you know, the young folks looking at our phones, or for other folks, you know, thinking about other folks, when we can actually just be with ourselves, right? Especially for so many of us who are caretakers, thinking about how much time you actually have when you can think about your togetherness with other people, but not being responsible for someone else. And that can be its own form of beginning to be embodied. So, okay. Would love to spend a couple minutes, a ton of questions, which is great, but would love to spend a couple minutes hearing other people's embodiment practices or how they're thinking about embodiment. And I'll invite folks to chat or raise their hands if you can make an offer of what you do. We can also go where the energy goes. If folks want to continue the conversation, we can. Okay, folks are still like reading all the different questions. So let me just review a couple things in the chat, and then I'm actually going to go to our next part. Because we'll get into some of like the applications. We do some storytelling, and I think that might inspire some folks. Okay, so some folks have mentioned that they're not even sure what embodiment means, which is great, because that's something that I assumed folks may know. So to back up a little bit, when I'm speaking about embodiment, I'm thinking about a sense that we are connected to our bodies, and connected to the fullness of our bodies, the wholeness of our bodies. And I mean that mostly in a physical way, but I think that has different dimensions when we think about, again, our connections between body and emotions and spirit. It gets expanded. But mostly when I think about embodiment, it's like what it means to be deeply connected to what is happening physically, physiologically, chemically, emotionally in our bodies. That's all I mean. I will be happy to send a really popular but really useful resource about white dominant culture to folks. Also, if you just do a general Google search for white dominant culture characteristics, you will probably find the same resource. So I'll do the best I can to contextualize that for folks, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time right at this moment speaking about those characteristics. There's another workplace question, and it's, do you have suggestions for compassionate ways to kind of point out the white dominant culture being perpetuated for someone who is not in a leadership position to change the culture? I say, hold on to that thought. I would love to bring that into the examples so we can work that out as a community. But I definitely have some thoughts and would love for you to think about giving us even more details about what you're dealing with. And finally, Laurel, I'll mention your comment and then I'll move on to the last slide we have for this section. What I am thinking about from what you've said is, if we are concerned about the suffering of others, i.e. we hold compassion for how Black folks experience white supremacy, then our, quote, compassionate interventions to promote principled growth about racism should primarily not perpetuate the suffering and harm of those we are concerned about, which can be difficult to do if we are overwhelmed, feeling shameful, enraged, or feeling such a sense of urgency we're unable to slow down. Yes, I think that's a great breakdown of what I'm trying to say. So to me, there's actually a theory of change with the healing of white folks, which is if white folks, as well as other aspects of ourselves that enjoy and benefit from powerful systems, if we can be not only aware of those are, but take a responsibility for them by not just understanding the concepts, but understanding how benefiting from those systems not only harm others, but actually don't support our wholeness either, because there's a certain flattening that happens, right, that exists by the ways that power can corrupt, right? So we can be really in touch with that and be in deep healing around that. Then that creates pathways for these systems to change, which to me is ultimately a really important part of it. I won't say that we have to rely on folks who benefit from power to allow those systems to be dismantled, but it's a lot easier to dismantle them if folks who benefit from systems are also dismantling them, right? So for me, like, I have my own commitment to a lot of economic solidarity because I grew up as a middle-class kid and live a pretty middle-class, upper middle-class lifestyle, right? So that means often I have to give something up, and that's something we'll get into here in a moment. What it means to actually move from power hoarding to power sharing. And that's not easy, but important. Okay, all right, this is the last important point before we get to, I'll allow it to introduce my final slide, and it's from Kate Lee. And it's this concern I hear often about white solidarity groups. It feels like navel gazing to talk about our own embodied feelings. So do you mean that if someone calls out a white dominant behavior, we focus the way it might feel, so folks in the office that are stuck in that place of white guilt can move through? yes, I mean that. But I think and this is going to be different from what some other people believe, right? But I do believe that there needs to be more attention to the unhealed parts of ourselves in white solidarity groups, because I do have a belief that trauma, unhealed trauma, replicates. So if you are if you're in spaces where folks have an external goal of ending white supremacy, but folks have very little awareness about the ways that white supremacy has really dehumanized them in a way, or flattened them, and have very little understanding of white dominant culture that you're perpetuating among each other, I guarantee your effectiveness as an ally won't be as strong. So I'm not saying that's your only work, right? Which I think navel gazing to me implies that we're just like really, really obsessed about some aspects of ourselves and only ourselves. If we're really understanding collective struggle, if we're really understanding interdependence, we have to be holding all those levels, where we're looking at the internal level, the personal level, the interpersonal levels, as well as the community and systemic levels, and at the same time, which is really hard. And I'm not sure there's another way to really authentically do it. That's my own view. All right, last but not least, return back to this PowerPoint and look at challenges to compassionate intervention with the emphasis on intervention. So there are a lot of folks who feel, especially folks who have a robust sense of spirituality, of groundedness, of connection, or even a deep sense of community, that struggle with intervention, the action piece. And there are a lot of reasons why that's true. And we need folks to be acting more. So some challenges that I've seen in my work and my journey, that some have simply neglected to cultivate courage to do what's necessary. I don't believe that courage simply exists, especially when you're talking about challenges to power, challenges to your own power. There is I think, emotional rigor that comes to cultivating that. And sometimes you can cultivate that by relating to a different part of yourself, right? So for example, if you're a white identified person, a white passing person who grew up really poor or in economic deprivation, you might know something about what it means to be a subject of systemic domination, especially if you come from intergenerational poverty. And some of the things that have made you be able to survive and be brave could be the things that can allow you to be brave in this context. But to me, it's a cultivation in the practice. It doesn't simply exist or it's assumed. We have to think about this as a practice to cultivate courage and courageous action. I'm aware that some folks might quibble with my word of courage, because if we're doing what's necessary, it's simply what is necessary. And I think that's fine. I can see that perspective. And I think there is a certain reality that if we are beneficiaries of a powerful system, we have to be moved in some way to challenge it. That's true for any kind of powerful system, but especially for a beneficiary. I think it takes something additional to move us toward acting against what might seem like our, quote, self-interest. I call that courage. You can call that whatever you need to. But whatever that practice is, to allow you to act and intervene and interrupt and disrupt, then it's important to pay attention to it. For some people, it's not a matter of acting, it's a matter of like, we're not sure what is the wisest way to act. And sometimes that can mean like we just get paralyzed, we don't do anything, or there's so much uncertainty that our process is so slow. And I love slowness. I'm a very earthy person. Slow can be great. And sometimes we need to move quickly though. So to me, here's a distinction between uncertainty and recklessness. We live in mystery all the time. And some of us, and I've learned a lot from elders in my life, that is something you can choose to get used to or not. But if we are accepting that a lot of our world is mysterious and uncertain, and we are using the best of our instincts and willing to learn from our inevitable mistakes, then we can be in our wisest action with humility and trust that we'll learn and do what we need to do at the time. But often, especially when we're talking about systems of power at any level of our lives, paralysis can be very, very harmful itself. And I will mention that one of the characteristics of white dominant culture that is often talked about is perfectionism. So there's also a difference between simply being uncertain and wanting to get it just right. Because that too is a fiction. I make mistakes every day, all the time. We all do. And the more we can accept that, the more we can probably be both honest with ourselves, honest with the world, and also try to be the best versions of ourselves and live at our values. Last but not least, some folks have cynicism about whether our contributions at all, or sometimes at certain levels, matter at all. And insecurity about what's enough. And this is a difficult one for me, I'll say. I think this can also too be a symptom of perfectionism. I do believe that there are some serious questions around doubt and faith that are really interesting for us to be honest about trying to understand the nature of harm in the world. There's so much suffering in the world, so much harm, so much brutality. And I think it's a really important spiritual question around, like, what does that mean for us? What are our contributions to counter that or to transform it? But to me, that's a very different set of grappling, and a question that we probably will never have very clear answers to than simply dismissing any action because we don't feel like any contribution is meaningful. And I probably would challenge folks who hold a lot of that view to think about moments in their life where they have acted and they felt like it has mattered. If you have that example, some people don't. And that can get into some deeper worldview questions and differences that I might have with that person. But especially in the face of power at this moment, politically, culturally, across the world, to me, it's a hard proposition to say that contributions don't matter. To me, less harm is less harm. So I'm going to pause again. And actually, I'm going to keep speaking because this is an important piece. So I have some ideas about moving through these challenges, and then we'll pause for more questions, and then we'll get into some examples so we can shift from a shared understanding to get into storytelling and understanding what this really means for us. So moving through these challenges of compassionate intervention. So I really think it is important internally for each of us to clarify our values and commitments and to get real about them. Some folks aren't very effective in white solidarity movements because they still have a lot of ambivalence about what they really want to see in terms of power shifting. I'm not sure if that's okay, but it's where folks can be. And we have to be honest about that. Similarly, we might have these really strong values and not have strong commitments yet. Maybe because we just don't feel affected enough yet. Maybe because we feel like other things are important too, or more important, and we just have to be real about that. And then sometimes I think folks continue to struggle with that question of enoughness, so they get stuck again in that paralysis of inaction. But I think folks have to be in a constant inquiry with themselves and check in with themselves about what my values and commitments actually are to dismantling white supremacy or any other, especially in white solidarity movements, right? Because I also come from a belief system that understands that if you're challenging one system of oppression, you are or have the opportunity to challenge others at the same time, because we're in that intersectionality reality, multidimensionality, intersectionality. So that clarification is really important and really a foundation to, I think, a lot of this kind of work. So getting back to my theory of change, doing our healing work, especially that of our shadows, all shades. So shadows is a term often used in folk healing and shamanic healing to describe the things that we're simply not fully aware of. It's also used in Jungian psychology. I think it's a whole way to think about just parts of ourselves that are not fully known to us yet, or fully explored, or fully conscious. And I use the qualification of all shades, informed by the work of a really great body worker and Dharma teacher, Abdi Asadi, who has a book called Shadows on the Path. And his work really emphasizes that sometimes we think about shadows as being things that societally we're ashamed of. But he also points out that things that have a lot of pride and status attached to them are also forms of shadows, because it can flatten our complexity as people. He uses this often in the context of thinking about a family, of thinking about the example of a good child, right? The overachieving child. So on one hand, the overachieving child can get a lot of praise for what they do. And a trade-off might be is that child continues to grow up and becomes an adult and feels like their value is inherently tied to what they achieve. So when they're not achieving, they feel less valuable. So that becomes a quote shadow. This also, I think, can translate into white solidarity work and gets into some of the projection aspects that I was mentioning earlier. So folks aren't, say, there's someone in a white solidarity community that you know that's really, really persistent about maybe, say, like policing people and language they're using. The question is, if the purpose of language is for us to understand each other, is this person simply persistent because they're not understanding other people? Or is it really important for them, for some reason, that you use particular language? And if it's the latter, it's probably shadow work that needs to be done. And if it's more the former and folks are not having a shared, it's revealing that there's not a shared sense of value or shared sense of commitment or shared sense of understanding, that could actually be really useful to draw out. Sometimes it's both those things and other things. But that's another thing what I mean by doing our healing work. If we're looking at all different levels at the same time, then we have space to say, okay, the way this person's showing up is helpful in this regard and detrimental in this other regard. And we can address what might feel detrimental. All right, a few more ways to think about moving through these challenges. Living among friends of integrity. This is a new term I'm using, friends of integrity, to describe people in our lives that tell us things we need to know. Folks who are both really honest with us and because they love us so fiercely can also relate to us and tell us these really hard things from a place of deep love. And some of what that means, I think, so often in white solidarity work is that we're actually not in deep relationship with each other. So when folks are like calling each other out, it's coming from this place of distrust, as it turns out. And I've seen a lot of active work, especially in Black liberation spaces, that really prioritize the deep relationship. At least here in DC, a lot of Black liberation spaces feel really strongly about having deep relationships with folks. Not only because that's just a value of our humanness, but because it's hard to think that we would put our bodies on the lines in like direct action work if we don't trust each other. And I think that's actually one thing from the 60s civil rights movement that younger folks are really adopting that really matters. But I think in white solidarity space, a lot of folks aren't in deep relationship with themselves, much less each other. So you're not telling each other the truth about things in a way that is coming from a deep place of love and connection and relatedness. So it's so important to have those friends of integrity, even if they're not necessarily folks that you are having these conversations with all the time, that you do have that kind of presence in your life. And with the beauty of the internet, for folks who might be isolated because they're in communities that don't believe in dismantling white supremacy, or folks who are very ambivalent about it, like tonight, I think there are spaces that you can find that can help support you. Two more things. Having a constant awareness and practice against white dominant culture conditioning and new programming. So by this, I mean to suggest that working through white supremacy is something that all of us will be doing for our lifetimes, and our children will be doing, and our children's children will be doing. So we're doing what we can right now. We have a vigilance and a practice, so we're acting on that vigilance about the ways that we've been poisoned by white dominant culture and white supremacy culture. And having some gentleness in how we hold that. This is a very, very long generational struggle that we're working with through our inheritance, and that we'll be passing on to our children, hopefully with less burden. Or at least a different set of burdens. New programming, I'm not super excited about that language, but it's a way of describing the new ways of being that we want to experience with one another. One big question I have in the Her series that it's a huge question to me is, whether we're working toward a new white identity or whether we just want to, it's actually more beneficial to dismantle white identity, because whiteness itself is a construct, right? That flattens so many experiences of so many people. So whatever we're trying to work toward, that it is a way that allows us to be in connected, deep relationship to each other, ourselves, each other, and all other beings that exist in this ecology of the world. Cool. Okay, last but certainly not least, moving through these challenges, I think it's predicated on a very serious examination and willingness to lose and to grieve. So by definition, if we're working toward ending white supremacy, that means that white folks will lose something. And there are some people that don't want to be explicit about that, but I think it's really important. And I think it's the reason why we see so many reactionary politics these days and reactionary behavior. Folks know they're losing something. That is true. And I think the more interesting conversation is, if there is loss, whether people really have the context of what they're losing. And as we think about other forms of loss and change and transformation, whether we actually have these robust practices to grieve. And grieving doesn't have to be somber. It can also be a praise practice for what we're gaining. But because I think in the US, by and large, there's not a lot of shared grieving practices. We just don't. And that becomes repressed, and that creates other problems. So those of us who are connected to spiritual community or tradition or culture, community, and tradition that have grieving practices, we can really rely on those to talk about and understand and examine what that means when we're actually losing a sense of entitlement or power. We're talking about redistributing power and resources. I think it'd be great to apply more of those practices and traditions to this question. And it's interestingly something I think that in the Black American tradition, we know really well, and we can even share with folks. So to me, these are some of the ways that we have to be thinking and feeling into moving through these challenges. These challenges of not cultivating courage, being paralyzed by what we don't know, by cynicism, by overwhelm and the stress reactions we have to that, overcorrection, overreaction, repressing or ignoring or trying to bypass guilt or shame, and challenging assumptions around equal force to harm and what that can create for us. All right. So we'll get to this last part here in a moment. I really want to pause to just see where we are. And then I finally want to get into some examples so we can really be feeling this through. But let me pause again for reactions, questions, clarifications. The chat is back. Okay. Some folks are telling me that they think they understood. It's a lot of complex stuff. I think about a lot of these things a lot of the time. So this is going to probably, some of these concepts might be really new for folks, so I invite you just to be with them. Maybe some of the storytelling will help. And portion is recorded. Great. Some folks are feeling validated. Oh, Caitlin, you have another question. Go ahead and unmute yourself and talk to us.
Hi, thank you, Rochelle. On this deep sense of loss and pain that I think I'm only recently tapping into in myself, and it's something I'm hoping to share and model with my family as I'm going through, our ancestry. And I've really benefited by reading more about Indigenous peoples in Europe. And I'm wondering if that's a conversation or resources or just like guidance on how to have those kinds of conversations with family, because it's a painful process to awaken grief and like tap into that sense of loss and really deep pain that I feel that my ancestors went through over God knows how many generations I'm removed from, spiritual earth-based practices, right? So any thoughts on that?
Sure, great. So this leads us into some of the ways we actually try to apply this. So I think for many people, it might be challenging if people feel, especially if you feel really removed to European descended, ancestors from 1, 2, 3 generations before, to feel connected to grief ritual. I think maybe a starting place is beginning just to, and I think you may have begun doing this, Caitlin, but maybe not, just beginning to have conversations with your family about even what people remember. What is the collective memory of your family about the migration story? The reasons folks found themselves here, what they left behind, what got language, traditions, food, what got lost over the years. And what are the stories that may not be true about how that occurred, right? What is the family mythology about? Various things that happened along the way, but also like what we know that happened to Indigenous people. Or do we know anything about enslaved people in our family? So I actually think for many folks, the grief process is even beginning to acknowledge that there's something to grieve and beginning to have some, like, at least introduce things that folks might have actively tried to ignore around, but maybe it can soften in tone, right? If you make the connection between not only harm families have done, or your family has done in particular, with that sense of like, before even that story, there's probably some sense of loss that's a part of it as well, right? So to bring them together for folks. Not to say that there weren't things going on in Europe, to be clear. But I think many families, especially folks who are not connected to any kind of like indigenous, pagan, other kinds of like nature-based traditions, that starting with a ritual might be really, really tough. But I think just starting these conversations could be a lifetime worth of work. Where's your where are you at with your family with that, Caitlin? Even just broaching those questions, if you want to answer. And you're currently on mute.
Where am I at? So over Christmas,
You're a little low, my friend. If you can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're better now.
the reason why I asked is because over Christmas I went through some binders from my dad's mom, who passed away when I was much younger, and had done a lot of genealogy research. And she annotated an article from the late 1800s that explained an ancestor who had arrived here in the 1600s, owned some land in the 1700s, and there was an anecdote documenting an exchange between my ancestor, Adam, ironically, and the local indigenous chief. They even said his name, Nashaway, and Nashaway said to Adam, "All my land," before the white man came. And I was processing this in front of my parents, and I should not have tried. And their reactions were very much, "Oh, well, you know, the Native Americans were fighting amongst themselves anyway, and our ancestors were escaping hardship themselves." And so it felt very dismissive. And so I wish I had had more tools and practice of how to bring out their own emotions in that and help them be more embodied and reflecting on what that made them feel. And instead I was very reactionary and really should have practiced on my own before trying to share and process that with them.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure a bunch of people can relate to that. Just hearing these replies where folks are definitely not being critical and just passing on mythology about how they understood other people to be. So, you know, as I mentioned in the slides, I think it's super important to continue to have your own practices to be prepared for that, right? Because we know that's what we're dealing with. Folks who are in complete denial about certain things, right? And other people's experiences, and have a lot of lack of compassion. The other thing I'll say is, like, I think some practices in like appreciative inquiry are really helpful. So yeah, Linda's like, yeah, some other people, yes. So just some like basic communication tools that can allow you to be able to acknowledge certain and affirm certain parts of what they believe and their experiences, and then having questions that challenge some of the what you believe to be assumptions, right? And appreciative inquiry is one like particular system, and it's a whole thing. But I think the general idea behind it, right, is to, I found a really effective strategy is to, as with all of us, right, I think a lot of us feel heard when there are aspects of what we're saying that's being acknowledged or reflected back to us or affirmed. And then things that are challenged, right, we find ways to actually ask real questions, right? And I think you and I have talked about like questions that are genuinely curious as opposed to questions that are just super loaded, right? And aren't really questions. So are we continue to be skilled in actually asking questions that have some level of openness? Because even if people are telling us things that we know are just like dismissive of a lot of other people's realities and experiences, if we're able to have some appreciation that this is how they feel about things, and we can hold it, we at least learn something about them, right? And we don't necessarily also have to take it on, right? It's something that we have to endorse or believe or even co-sign. But at the very least, we learn about them. At the same time, these questions can allow for some deepening where it may not otherwise be possible, right? Because they're probably not having these conversations elsewhere. Some initial thoughts. I would love to hear, yep, thank you, Linda, yes. I would love to hear other people's compassion approaches, whether it's thoughts or things that you've tried with family members in particular. I think that is a huge area for a lot of people. What have you tried? What would you like to try?
me. Hi. Is it okay if I talk, or can anyone hear me?
Yes, you're a little low, but I can hear you.
Okay. For me, I think the challenge with my family is, yeah, like knowing exactly when it's like too critical, or not seeing like my sibling as her whole self, um, and also like my own self. I think like some things that have um, been really great is when I've been able to process things that we share together that we do that are um, very white supremacy, and being like, oh, like I think this is white supremacist of us to kind of, or I think this is like part of white culture to like be kind of doing this, and we kind of like looked at it together and like, oh, that's true. Like maybe we can work on that, or like maybe we can be accountable for each other of like whole trying to work on that together.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, some of us do have family members who are getting it or on that journey, and really spending time and space to cultivate deeper relationships with them and process things together is really awesome. So especially when you're like at the next family gathering, there's a sense of less isolation, right? That might allow you to show up differently and allow you to be able to hold witness or hold conversation differently. It's a beautiful example. Reading through the chats. And we'll get to this in a moment. I want to just make sure that anyone else who wanted to share about family dynamics and interacting with family has space to share.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll just share that I went through a whole process of deciding whether or not to attend a large family reunion. I grew up in the South under Jim Crow and left before integration, basically. So my whole family from that side of my family, their identity is not just white supremacist, but Southern. And anyway, I was toying with going. I have 3 Black grandchildren, and I was wrestling with the whole question of my own integrity, because I was not presenting that, even though people had the information. And I had thought attending this myself, not them, but myself, would be sort of like standing in a different tradition of development of my family. But then my cousin, who I'm closest to, she and her husband are, very progressive white people. They actually called me urgently, urging me not to come because they thought that I would be attacked. And that not even my immediate family, but the families that my family had married into were actually affiliated white supremacists. And so anyway, it's my immediate ties to that family are all dead now. And it's more just, it is an example of, I ended up agreeing with her that there was no reason. I'm doing my own work about that whole part of my ancestry. And our ancestors were actually settlers. So, there's a lot. But that I did not need to put myself in the position where I had to take that direct attack. And of course, I imagined I wouldn't be able to do it without in some way having it pass to my children and grandchildren, which I did not want to do. So anyway, I'm interested in anyone's comment, but I made the decision to just say, that is my ancestry, but those people are not now my family.
Thank you so much. And I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly. Can you?
Leanne.
Leanne. Okay, great. Thank you, Leanne. Whew. I took a few deep breaths as you were sharing. Thank you. And I'll ask if other folks want to respond to Leanne's request for feedback or openness for that, to think about how we were grounding our sense of compassion, right? So I think Leanne shared a lot of different factors that were in consideration, including the safety of grandchildren and making that decision. And for some folks, I think there might be some initial reactions of like, we have to show up in these spaces, right? And interrupt things. And that might be what many folks feel like they're called to do now. So I think this itself can be a good moment in like compassion of thinking about like, if you're considering all these things, including life-threatening conditions, not so much what you would do, but like, what can you relate to? And have there ever been circumstances that have been similar for you? And how'd you navigate them?
Have there ever been what circumstance?
Yeah, I wonder if other people have had similar circumstances they've had to navigate. And how did they handle them, right? So that's what I mean, like framing around relating and not judging folks so quick. So it's a tough position to be in. That's an incredibly tough decision to make. And I want to lift up what you said at the end, which I think is true for so many people, which is when we come from legacies and families that are really far from even examining these things and actually have a lot of pride in them, are very protective of them. Where are the spaces that we have intimacy and family elsewhere so we're not orphaned? I think it's a really real question for a lot of people. And Linda, I would love for you to respond.
Leanne, what I was wondering, I can see how threatening that environment would be. And I'm wondering if the cousin and her husband who advised you to stay away, what would it been like if you had gone with a support system, if they had gone and together, you were not alone in facing this? What difference might that have been for you?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I was trying to think about the compassion component of this, because when I spoke, I wasn't really addressing that. But my father, who is the key to all this, was a devout anti-racist Baptist, if you can imagine, in his generation. And he actually split with the family, and he was more of a tradition, not that you don't speak, but sort of which side are you on? And let's draw a line here. And when he had the opportunity, he left. But he then became just a center for my cousins who wanted to separate from their parents. So it's an interesting thing. But what my cousin, that particular cousin, did say is, come another time. Basically, we would love to hug you up. We would love to have your family. Let's not waste it on this other thing, which I completely agreed with. So I felt their compassion for me, but I know it's not in the same sense that you're using the concept. I have to work on it a little.
Thank you both for modeling. That was really beautiful. And I want to create space for Janelle. I think you wanted to also respond to Leanne. I can unmute you if you like. Otherwise, we can come back to you perhaps. Oh, Jean, great. Jean with the exclamation point.
Oh, I didn't even know there was an exclamation point. Anyway, yes, I was just gonna say, I mean, I can understand that can feel, or I mean, I can understand with the large crowd of family members being, yeah, and coming from a settler ancestry. And my family, like, there was some like not as like Ku Klux Klan kind of thing going on in my great uncle's house. And going back to meet the great aunt that's surviving, it was interesting because you know, I started talking to her just like about my own life and just my community being more than white people, and uh, trying to talk to her about, you know, was this a thing? Because my mom talked to me about it, and she's like, no, no, no. But it's also great because the neighbor who moved in across the way was a black woman who, and this comes up because she, when I kind of was like, oh, hi, and I got to talk to her a little bit, and she invited us both over to her house. And so that was the first time that my great aunt, who was in this very white supremacist situation, and obviously like I am too, but the white supremacist situation, got to meet someone who was not white supremacist and non-white, I guess, and that was like a, I guess like having, I guess I would just suggest like maybe if you feel comfortable, Leanne, of like having more one-on-one conversations, maybe can facilitate like those situations where like race can be talked about and like healed from, maybe, and you know, maybe getting to see that, like, okay, well, maybe it starts with like just understanding that like neighbors are someone to meet, etc.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you for that story, and thank you for that offer, generous offer. I do want to create space because there are at least 2 more examples that have been shared with us, and from Linda and Caitlin. And Linda, I want to check in with you to see if you want to share more about this particular example that you shared on chat.
Actually, two that I shared, so I'm not sure which one. But they're related. So our community, and Linda, who's on the call, she may pop in because she and I are in this together. But
I think Linda's here. Great.
So we have a coalition of many different groups who are working on the sort of remembrance, reconciliation, and healing regarding lynchings that happened in our county. And we're working with the Equal Justice Initiative, the Maryland Lynching Project, and people in the, most impacted communities. And we had a very well-attended event, but I would say 3/4 of the people were white and 1/4 were black. And it's like, how do you create a space for the anger, the hurt and anger that were there? Because it seemed like we had a meeting about this last night, and seemed like for a lot of white people it was more of an intellectual exercise, learning about this history and, oh, isn't that terrible? But how do you kind of contain in a healthy way and not suppress the level of anger that comes in dealing with this history? So one of the things that happened in the meeting was when a Black person expressed a lot of the anger and frustration, it seemed like a lot of whites wanted to kind of jump in and say something. And another white friend said, let's just wait a minute and leave some silence here. And I thought that was very helpful and effective, and it allowed space then for another Black person who was present to express their sentiments. So anyway, that's what so in future events, we're trying to figure out how do you have it be something where people's needs for healing are addressed. I mean, they're not going to be fully met, but addressed and acknowledged.
Thank you for that. That's such hard work. I had a opportunity to go on pilgrimage to EJI's Memorial Museum back in October.
Wow.
In Montgomery, and it was really profound and very emotional.
Sure.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think I've had an experience like that before. And I so appreciate that example of just offering space. It sounds like that silence did two things at least. It allowed folks to feel like the expressions that they had were just actually received, right? Like you said, not shut down immediately because folks were just like afraid to be with it. It also feels like it recentered things, right? From being like maybe the discovery of some white folks and just like, can you believe this happened? To folks who are just like, yes, like this, I feel this viscerally, right? And it recenters where the attention is. So I think that's a really beautiful practice. And I think something even as simple as, I feel like altars are really powerful. So altars spaces. So having especially when you're talking about lynching and those kind of spaces, offering people of color an opportunity to put even in the center of the circle, the front of the room, the names of loved ones. They don't have to be loved ones that they know that they experienced lynching or violence, but the names of loved ones and ancestors that they just carry with them so that they're invoked in the room even, right? Along with adding, right, if there are any names or families or specific places that are known where that you all are discovering, right, or can document and capture where lynchings have occurred, that can be added to the altar space too. And that can be a space that literally and metaphorically holds and honors what is bringing you all together, which is really important.
Thank you.
Sure. It's really beautiful work. So actually I want to move on to the last chat question, and then want to open space for any remaining examples that folks want to work through. And this is from Caitlin. And this is a really, I think, challenging one. That's good. And she asked, Rochelle, how can we talk to others about the importance of healing for white people? And I'll caveat this is an invitation to everyone. In mixed race settings, it can come off as more centering of whiteness, especially if a white person is the messenger. That's very true. And I've seen it trigger people of color who react like, quote, what do you have to heal from? End quote, especially compared to Black and brown communities. It's a great question. I'm very aware that when I talk about healing for white folks, people are puzzled but not threatened. They usually want to hear more. And I do know some white folks who do some similar work, and they get hate mail, not exaggerating, right? Which is a whole different, I think, paradox for folks in wide solidarity spaces, but we'll pin that for later. So I think part of the way of navigating this is maybe around language. So I've noticed when you talk about healing for white folks, right? Some people can have the reaction that you're mentioning. It's like, are you really comparing the suffering of white folks, the dehumanization of white folks, to be anywhere equal to the suffering and dehumanization of Black and brown and other people of color, Indigenous folks too? And I think there's probably not a way for people to unhear that, right? I do think that is a trauma response to being erased constantly, and just a sensitivity that's probably going to exist for some time longer. I have seen if we use the words, and this is an interesting movement thing, right? If you use the words, we need to hold white people accountable for the harm that they learn and perpetuate to themselves and especially to people of color. Some folks are more open to that if you use the word accountability and then break down what that actually means, right? It's actually healing, but because now accountability has this huge tent, we can maybe use it as a pathway for folks to hear you. I've also used like some more colloquial language and said like, say, white people, you need to come get your people, right? Or another version of saying that is like, white folks need to accept the harm that they believe caused and the way that they're still like living it out. And if they can really examine that, we can really get to the root of some issues, right? So I think both using language that people are a little less triggered by and being even more specific about what you mean around healing can be really important, because that allows folks to, if not bypass the trauma response, to be able to have a signal that you are not ignoring or dismissing or marginalizing their real pain, and an indication that your values and politics are actually similar, right? I think that comes from not only the trauma response of feeling like people are dismissed, but also feeling like you are suspect, right? But in reality, I know you, Caitlin, like you are as committed as any other person in white solidarity or more. But I still think healing is a concept that's super new to so many folks in thinking about healing from political systems or politicized and cultural systems. And I think that's especially new, not only in white dominant communities, but super new in like mixed race conversation. You know, as Linda spoke about, we're still grappling with like enslavement, imperialism from the country's founding, right? We barely scratched that. So I think folks are still just deeply tender, and shift in language might really help. Are there any other suggestions that folks have, or less suggestions, I'm sorry, stories that you have from similar experiences that you can share and how you navigated? And Caitlin, feel free to chat kind of your initial reactions. I also know this concept's a little bit newer, and Caitlin's been like, great. We've been in a long time conversation about this, so it may not be where other folks are at, but I appreciate y'all holding space for it. Great. Yep, so many questions, I'm sure. So we'll be in continued conversation about navigating that. I would love for us to be in a space where we can talk about healing for white folks as being a really important part of actually dismantling white supremacy. Leanne?
Well, I'm kind of new to this discourse. I think this may be the first time I've even heard the expression white solidarity movement because I come out of more of a national liberation, civil rights movement, strategic alliance led by Black revolutionaries. That's a different period in history, but so I'm challenged by the notion of healing, that's actually what the goal is, because having settler, really early, my ancestors were here really early, and those who came later were actually homesteaders. So I really am very invested in the work, but I have never thought that this was work for white people to do together. And I understand that it's also not the job of Black people to do that work, although obviously you're willing to do that. So this is just an inquiry for me about I have to really try on this healing thing, but what other language might there be, or what would I substitute for? It is like shadow work. So, in lived experience, I can experience a healing that's rooted in knowledge. And also, in my story, my mother had postpartum depression. So my good dad realized I wasn't taken care of. So he immediately got me another mother. So the mother that raised me was a Black woman. So this is really a lot of stuff. And I'm interested in what you think about that, but I have not taken this work into any kind of collective arena with other white people. I've used actually more embodied modes of dealing with it. I have a very elaborate sunrise, spiritual practice. I do deep tapping with somebody on these issues. I talk to the woman who raised me, in ethereal terms. And actually, Tammy Lorraine's my friend who introduced
yes,
me to
Tammy.
you.
Yes.
And so she's a willing listener to these kind of things. But something about the word healing makes it seem to me like, and I guess this is because I'm not in the healing discourse, like it's something you're going to achieve or arrive at, rather than an ongoing process, which I feel like I totally know is much more urgent, deeper, profound, and uplifting to all of us, to be done by the Black people who I lived with when I was there at the time. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing so deeply. I felt that on a few levels. And the one thing mostly I just appreciate hearing you. And I'm 33. I love hearing from folks who've been in the world longer than me and seen some things, The one thing I'll reflect back is I feel like you use the word process. I think that's a beautiful word that might be more useful to you than healing. You're just like, I'm in process.
Right.
I'm in process.
Journeying is what I usually say.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Love it. I think I relate to that a lot. So thank you for just, sharing where you are at this moment on your journey. So I think we are close to being in a space to close. I think I feel energetically we've shared a lot. So thank you all for being super generous with your attention and time, and also just like your open curiosity to some really big questions that are really impacting us at all these different levels. So I'm going to end, of course, with the James Baldwin quote, but maybe not the one you're thinking. I am reading Fire This Time. Rereading it, I think, second time. And I just really want to continue to invite this level of conversation with each other about what it means to be able to help the deep transformation that we all need in the world in a way that also doesn't continue cycles of violence. That's ultimately what I feel is like my own integrity. And it might be something you relate to as well. So I'm going to share my screen one more time with you all. We're going to go to this part here. So just things to continue to think about in terms of skills and resources that we might need. And this, I think, got to some of what Caitlin was speaking about with family, like having real sense of grounding in how you do that, whether it's just being able to return back to your breath or some more elaborate practices that you have but having the skills to really understand what it means to be aware of self and remain centered and integrity when there might be a lot of strong atmospherics around you or strong emotions or feelings is really vital, because otherwise we can find ourselves in these cycles of reactivity that can escalate and cause even more harm and violence. I think more practice that we can have with direct communication is really important. And direct communication can be very compassionate and very emotional. But it's a way to allow us to continue to be honest with ourselves and others, which combats the ways in which some parts of white supremacist culture can obscure and confuse and conflate. Resilience practices, I have a complicated relationship with the word resilience, but if we think about the nature of folks, if you have parts of yourself that enjoy power for long periods of time, you might find yourself really fragile actually, or really insecure, or really threatened by the loss of that power. So what does it mean to have a deep understanding and again, felt sense and embodiment that allows you to understand that you might be in a process of loss or change, and you're still you and you're still okay. And to remind that and reflect that to the people that are around you. And y'all, none of this is possible without relationships. And I can't underestimate, we can underestimate and not emphasize enough the importance of relationships as being foundational to all of this. Okay, last but not least, this James Baldwin quote: "People pay for what they do, and still more for what they have allowed themselves to become. And they pay for it very simply by the lives they lead."